So, in the average American congregation, there are around 400 people, with women representing on average 60% of that 400 people. On average, there are on average 7 women who have experienced clergy sexual misconduct. So, what is sexual assault? Sexual assault is the illegal sexual contact that usually involves force upon a person without consent, or is inflicted upon a person who is incapable of giving consent, or who places the assailant in a position of trust or authority. So who are these people capable of giving consent? These can include children, or those who are physically or mentally incapacitated. And who are the assailants placed in authority? This can range anywhere from doctors, teachers, or those in religious leadership positions. In an investigation on the Baptist Convention, there were 200 Southern Baptist pastors, youth pastors, and deacons who were convicted and took plea deals for sex crimes over the past 20 years, leaving behind over 700 victims. To put these numbers into scale, out of every 1,000 rapes, only 384 reported to the police, which then leads to 57 that result in arrest, 11 prosecuted, and only 7 resulting in actual convictions. Sexual assault in the church is considered a unique betrayal. According to the Australian Psychology Society, it is the ultimate deception by an abuser who transgresses their duty of care and abuses their power. Most survivors take on average of 23 to 24 years to disclose this assault, and that's even if they decide to disclose their assault. This is largely due to the repression of trauma, as well as children not knowing how to properly convey what has happened to them. Not only is the survivor confronting their assailant, but they're also confronting the congregation. Many victims have recounted how difficult it was to discuss their assault with their family as well, because their family held their clergy members in such high regard. The victims said that they had a difficult time finding support because it's difficult to form a tear in an institution that one holds in such a high regard. However, since the abuser is placed on a moral high ground, church and family members cannot face the psychological trauma that comes with something when you come to the realization that someone that you hold with such high regard and you trust with your spiritual life is actually not infallible. Victim blaming also takes place in the church due to purity culture that is focused directly on women. Linda Kay, author of Pure, the book that focuses on purity culture experience in the church, says that many of her interviewees and her were taught that men are weak when faced with temptation of the female flesh, and it was therefore women's responsibility to protect men from the threat that their bodies posed on them. We had to walk, talk, and dress just right to ensure the alleged purity of our entire community, safeguarding against all sexual expression outside of marriage. The implication being that if anything did happen, even sexual violence, was our fault. Once the purity culture is gone, once that purity that they have is gone, their image is damaged in the eyes of the church. They lose their credibility. In my research, I found a common issue. Sexual assault is a difficult crime to convict because it usually presents as a case of he said, she said, or she said, he said. It is often put that no one asks you if you want to be robbed, but victims of sexual assault are often addressed as having wanted it. So, what is the potential aftermath of sexual assault in the church? Research has identified post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a common psychological effect of clergy-perpetrated child abuse. Victims are also more likely to be afflicted by self-harming and suicidal behaviors, as well as alcohol misuse, depression, and anxiety. There's also anxiety surrounding the church and clergy members, which can lead to a disconnect in one's relationship with God. This brings us to Rachel Denhollander. When Rachel was 7 years old, her parents suspected that she had been assaulted by a member of their small group. Denhollander's parents went to their small group for help, and no one believed them, and went as far as to not allow Rachel to play with their children for fear of them being assaulted or accused of assaulting her. Rachel's parents dropped the matter because they felt they could do nothing unless the member actually assaulted Rachel. However, they did not know Rachel had already been assaulted 2 months prior, but she was too young to articulate what had happened. The college student in the small group had masturbated with 7-year-old Rachel Denhollander sitting in his lap. After no one in their church community listened to them, her parents were so frustrated that they left the church and never returned. Denhollander recounts that as a child going through this, all she could understand was that her being assaulted made the church mad, and that she was no longer able to play with some of her friends. Denhollander was led to believe that she was the problem. Denhollander went as far to vow that if she were ever to be assaulted again, she would not disclose it, because if her own church could not support her, then how could she expect anyone else to? She must be the problem. Rachel Hollander later went on to be assaulted by Larry Nassar in the well-known sexual assault cases involving the U.S. gymnastics team. However, she went against her vow, and she was the first person to accuse Larry Nassar of said sexual assault, and she went on to become an attorney and was a prosecuting attorney on Larry Nassar's case. There are roughly 1,700 priests and clergy members who have been accused of committing acts of sexual violence that hold positions such as teachers, nurses, or volunteers with children at risk. Children at risk qualify as children who have been in foster care systems, who have grown up in poverty, or suffer from different mental illnesses. Boz, a former Florida state attorney, and his time as an attorney, he prosecuted several sexual assault cases, said that he once dealt with a pastor that did not report a sexual offender in his church because the man had repented. The offender later abused 5 more children before being arrested. This also brings us to Roger Sinclair. Roger Sinclair was removed by the diocese after assaulting a 17-year-old boy. However, he was never brought to the police. After his dismissal, he assaulted a developmentally disabled man. Not only did the church fail the survivors in these instances, but they also failed the perpetrators. Like the survivors of the assault, the assailants are also God's children. The church is doing a disservice to them when they do not hold them accountable for their actions. Most psychologists believe that rapists are psychologically disordered because of childhood experiences that twist them to behave in socially forbidden ways. So when we do not address the issues at hand and we don't seek help for them as well as the victims, we are harming both of them in this instance, as well as future victims that could have been spared from these incidents. Despite common belief, this is not just a problem in the Catholic Church. The reason why it seems more prevalent in the Catholic Church is because newer evangelical churches lack the bureaucratic record of systemic abuse that the Catholic Church possesses. In fact, Pope Francis even established a new law. This law requires the world's 415,000 Catholic priests, as well as the 660,000 religious sisters, to report any cases of sexual assault. Paige Patterson, who was the past president of the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, was revoked from his position as president after ignoring a rape victim. A rape victim went to Patterson to discuss the alleged rape and was advised not to report her assailant to the police, and she should best handle the issue in a biblical way by forgiving him. The woman was later put on a 2-month probation, and it was never disclosed to her as why she was on probation. However, she was led to believe by Patterson himself, as well as other faculty members, that it was because she had allowed the man into her bedroom. So what does God say about all of this? In Deuteronomy 22, 25-29, God says that being with a woman forcefully is the same as murder. Obviously, the same concept applies to being with a man forcefully. It can go both ways. Titus 1, 7-14 says that God's stewards are held to a higher standard, and they should not abuse their power. In Luke 20:47, when the Pharisees take advantage of the widows, God condemns not only the sexual aspect of the assault, but also the abuse of religious authority that takes place. In Matthew 5:27-28, God says that looking at a woman with lustfulness is considered adultery. This brings us to a quote from Sam Allberry. Sam Allberry says that God cares about a person's sexuality so much so that he condemns anyone violating it, even in the privacy of their own home, or of their own mind. I believe that we as Christians often prioritize the image of the church. However, in doing this, we are in fact tarnishing the church's image. The church is often caught in the limelight for instances such as the report of those 200 Baptist pastors. And in the cover-up of these assaults, we are not being stewards of God's creation. So we are in fact not representing what it actually is that God has called upon us to do. However, there are ways that we can help in these situations. One avenue you can take is by finding different foundations such as the Joyful Heart Foundation. The Joyful Heart Foundation provides direct aid and protection to victims and survivors of sexual assault, as well as victims of domestic violence. Grace, the godly response to abuse in the Christian environment, trains Christian institutions in preventing sexual abuse and performs independent investigations when churches face said abuse. However, it is unfortunate that we do not have a lot of outreach programs directly rooted in the church. So another way to help with that is getting into your church and finding ways to create these support systems, having designated outreach groups for survivors, because at the end of the day, we shouldn't be a place that strikes fear in a survivor's heart because of how we've handled past incidents. We should be a place they can come to for help and rehabilitation. Thank you.
All right. Well done. All of our visitors, especially faculty, I want to open it up to you first. If you have any comments or questions for Delilah, please feel free to offer those.
Did you say that there was a delay of almost 25 years for some women before they reported?
23 to 24, and that's strictly in cases within the church. Because most of the assaults take place with children, so they either can't articulate it or they repressed said incidents. But a majority of those cases do not get reported at all.
Do you believe the Catholic Church has done a good job of intervening in these cases with priests?
I think that there has been a lot of cover-up that the Catholic Church is acknowledging now. Obviously, there's still a long ways to go because there are still a great deal of cover-ups that take place and relocation of priests. However, I think that they are showing that they care about the issue in implementing these new laws, but of course, everyone still has a long way to go in addressing these issues.
So what do you say to someone who is abused in a church and never wants to go back to church again? Well, how would you counsel that person?
I think the first step is admitting that the church was wrong in how they dealt with this victim. That's definitely going to be a reassurance to let the victim know that we did not handle this in the way we should have, and our actions are not a representation of what God has called us to do, because God called us to be stewards of His creation and not to turn them away in situations like this to preserve our own views and ideologies of those around us.
One final question. In education, I've noticed recently, within the last 5 years, that there's more women who abuse male students. Are there instances of women that are assaulting men in churches?
There are. As far as, this is just general statistics for rape as a whole, 90% of sexual assaults with adults are men against women, and it's only 1% of women perpetrators. The other 99 are male perpetrators in all sexual assault cases.
Dr. So just interject in that, I think that would, statistically, I think there would be a story to be told on how much women have a presence in school leadership, and because you're right, like in education versus leadership in churches to begin with. Like, I wonder if
women are more disproportionately higher in population as staff,
which I think is a parallel issue, but also I think there's a correlation versus causation and so on. I think there's a story to be told there as well. Anything else?
Delilah, I did a good job. Thank you. You had mentioned help for the perpetrators. So thoughts on that? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, or is there anything out there for?
Unfortunately, it is a very tough pill to swallow, helping the perpetrators in these instances. So I know there are support groups for child predators as well as just rapists in general. However, I think there is obviously a large stigma around these groups, so a lot of people don't want to willingly admit to said things and do outreach groups. But I know after serving prison sentences, a lot of, perpetrators have court-mandated counseling therapy sessions with these either group therapies or one-on-one therapy.
Delilah, I noticed a strong tone where you kind of presented that women are not believed right away. Interesting. So is there a patriarchy that exists here where men are trying to protect other men?
I think it's less of trying to protect other men and trying to protect the image of the church as a whole. I think there's more psychological depth to it, that in believing that, say, this person has been assaulted, you're also accepting the fact that if my pastor or priest was willing to do it to this woman, it could have been me as well. And we personally, I don't think any of us would want to accept that someone that we trust with our walk with God and to teach us and guide us through these things is capable of doing such things. However, anybody's capable of sin. So that is something we have to come to grasp with. I'm sorry.
Are the majority of cases minors?
In the church, yes, it's a majority of minor cases, because the children are also, often the priest or pastor will approach the child by saying, this is God's will, this is what God wants to happen. And obviously these children are fresh in their walk with God, and they just want to please and do what's right. In fact, I had a family member who as far as I know, was never actually physically assaulted, but there were several instances in which they were very close. And he had not put together what it was that had happened until he was roughly in his 20s, and it happened when he was in elementary school. And when he went back to the school, he went to a private school to address what had happened, the priest had been relocated.
They just shifted him to another parish
Yes, sir.
without telling the new parish? That's pretty standard, wasn't it, in the Catholic Church?
I think personally, I believe the Catholic Church to be, I've grown up Catholic. They run their religion as sort of a government with how the Pope works and everything. So they have the means to transport these people, whether it be you'll now go stay in this parish and you'll serve in solitude, or just relocating in order to preserve the image of the church because we are so inundated with these assault cases.
So what are churches doing today to protect, their church for one, but to protect them as employees and leaders? I know we take steps here to protect, on both ends. So what are churches doing?
Today's churches, it's more of just covering up the instance and flipping it onto the victim and saying, oh, well, you should not have worn this thing, or you should not have insinuated these things. So I think that's, if I'm getting your question right.
More like boundaries or
Boundaries?
in other words, man, woman, we're not meeting together to discuss without the presence of another female or
I
something
think
like
that
that.
is a tricky aspect of it, because a lot of people sometimes do need one-on-one conversations with their pastors or priests, and that is what makes it so difficult in dealing with these convicted crimes. I think that's something that the church is trying to work out. That's something that Grace works with, is preventing these sexual abuses, so finding certain avenues to go about still being able to have that connection that is so greatly needed with your pastor or priest, while also maintaining a sense of protection for yourself as well as themselves.
So I'm interested in Ashley's response on the church discipline presenter. What should the church do after there's a case? How should church discipline effectively be employed?
Well, I actually really liked what she said about how you're actually harming all parties involved when it's not addressed. So you're harming both the victim and the perpetrator by not addressing the situation. And, a lot of my presentation was about that church discipline is about protecting the image of the church, but when it's unhealthily practiced, then there's repercussions, like people being blamed for things that weren't their fault. I think she did.
Appreciate that.
I too thought you did an amazing job, and your tone was so serious because you're right, this is a very serious issue. My question is, when you spoke about all of us getting involved as we're able or passionate about the subject, what would you see are the characteristics that would make up a place, a group, a person who people would be willing to go to?
I know a lot of college campuses actually have these sexual assault outcry victims or outcry groups who go through a course to become accredited to be handling these situations. So I think as far as the church, just having a designated group of people who are willing to volunteer for said training, to be there, willing and able to help these victims would be a great way to solve that.
Delilah, I thought a really interesting part of, and you went a little more in depth in your paper, like with all of it, obviously, but you mentioned purity culture, and I think you did a really good job of concisely explaining. Maybe expound on that a little bit more. That this is obviously, I think most of the issues we're talking about, and like with Ashland's and these in-house church issues, it's a character issue. These are the types of people that are going to, they're predators. There's a reason why we call them that, right? And so because they have this character to be a predator, I get what you're saying in terms of the purity culture almost not encouraging that, but excusing it, excusing that you're the type of person can't control yourself and that's not your fault. Could you expound a little bit on the whole purity culture thing and how that relates to your topic? I don't know, just in general. I know it's a vague question, but I just think it's something that needs to be elaborated on.
So I think purity culture comes into play, honestly, a lot more with the church members' response rather than the actual perpetrator themselves. I think, once again, it's used as sort of a scapegoat in denying the fact that this person is capable of doing such things and rather saying, oh, well, they couldn't help it because this woman is dressed in this way or behaved in this manner. And regardless of how the person has dressed or has behaved, that does not excuse under any circumstances the party's actions. So that can be used either by the assaulter to say, oh, well, they did this thing. And since we are in that religious setting that does focus a lot on how women dress, I mean, I think growing up in a private school, we've all felt that issue within like dress code books with how ours are girls' dress codes are 2 to 3 paragraphs long, and the guys are typically about a paragraph in comparison. So I think that becomes an easy avenue for the church members to say, oh, this is why it happened, also for the perpetrator to say, and then that leaves the victim feeling as though, once again, it was their fault. And that also can lead to that long 23 to 24 year period in which it takes them to disclose said matters.
And I'll amen to that, and I'll add to that. I think I hadn't thought of it that way, but you hit the nail on the head that there's this discrepancy between what's expected of girls and women versus what's expected of boys and men. And I'll do you one. I think you're more right than you realize, just because you can find examples to where wherever that standard is of dress code, where it's like, I wouldn't have done it if they had met this standard. The standards are much more stringent and much more strict, and we still have this problem. You know, the clothes are as long as they're supposed to be, and we still have the problem. So, yeah, very, very well said. Classmates, you got anything for Delilah?
Do you think these people in authority positions are like bending the Bible and believe that it's not wrong? Or do you think that they know?
I think in a lot of cases they acknowledge that it's wrong because they do follow through with a lot of those cover-up and relocation plans after having been accused. However, there probably are some cases in which they feel that they're called by God to do said thing. But obviously, I think at that point it's more of a mental factor taking place rather than what they've learned.
You think that most churches don't like to disclose the things, just like you said, they're trying to make something bad, people that they're too scared to, like, make it, like, oh, our church is gonna, our congregation is gonna have no attendance anymore, like, we can't say this, and that's why.
I think that is largely a reason, and I don't think that they process the fact that in a lot of instances these do come out in larger reports, these numbers do, which ends up, I feel like, almost marring the image of the church more so, because it shows that not only did they have a member or religious leader who has committed such a crime, but the rest of the members were also willing to take place in covering this up, or just in poor treatment of the survivor. So it really puts more of a stain on the church's image than the actual act.
And I think there's something to be said about both of those questions being connected, that the justification, because they're both along the lines of justification, right? That it's, oh, well, if we allow this to get out, it's going to inhibit the gospel ministry. It's going to inhibit what the church is trying to do and trying to accomplish. And that's used as justification. Okay, well, we got to cover it up or else the name of Christ is going to be marred. And it's like, okay, the name of Christ has already been marred by merit of the fact that this actually happened. So there's that. But yeah, I think both of those questions are connected.
Do you think that if the church would just be honest about the things that happened and address that it was wrong, that it might actually make more people want to come to a church that would address and be honest about issues like that? And like, can you get what I'm asking?
Mm-hmm. I think it would definitely show a more hospitable environment to survivors of sexual assault cases. I do think obviously it may curb attendance by a regular church member just out of, I guess, just dealing with what has happened. Because when it doesn't matter if you're the one assaulted or if you're in close proximity to, there is that realization of, wow, that could have been me. So I think it takes everybody time to heal on these sort of processes.
I asked a lot of questions that are beyond the scope, I think, of the project. Like,
Okay.
what's the cure for purity culture? Like, we've seen the results are in on purity culture, and it's not good. What's the solution? Like, what is the solution for to like relocation after repentance? Like, okay, well, that isn't the solution. That's clearly not the solution. But I think there's something to the idea of like, you don't have to look far in our culture for organizations that hate women and are perfectly willing to cover up their abuse and to ignore it and to blame it on them and to whatever else. And so like, what if we made the church a space that looks different from the culture in the fact that it is willing to disclose this and to deal with it and to like take Jesus at his word when he says like, the truth sets you free. Like, it's actually, the truth, it might hurt first, but it will set you free. But there is no freedom absent this idea of the truth. None of this is a question. Did you find anything about the story of Delilah?
I did not.
So Delilah was a secretary, administrative assistant, excuse me, something like that at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, who had a multi-year affair with her boss. And later, talking about the 23 to 24 year period it takes for someone to disclose, later looked back at the situation and understood like, oh, that was abuse. Because there was a power relationship in which I did not have the ability to tell this man no. And so she disclosed that. Southwestern came forward, hey, we recognize this. Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, by the way, the former president of which was Paige Patterson. Southwestern says like, yeah, that was abuse. You were right. Southern Baptist Convention, yes, that was abuse. And yet, there are all these men in the Southern Baptist Convention, one of whom is running for president in the next convention, who looks at the story of Delilah and tells her that's not abuse, that's adultery, it's unfair. That she's now trying to excuse her sin by calling it abuse or unfair. So, I feel like I'm talking the Brooks thing as well now. To what extent is like the theology propping up these institutions itself diseased, poisoned? Like, what do we have to, this is again beyond the scope of the presentation, what do we have to get rid of in order to make the church the place that it's supposed to be?
I think a lot of it's first reaction. No, you're good. I think a lot of it weighs on that first reaction to the survivor. Once again, like with being presented with, oh, well, that was an abuse. You wanted it. You participated with it with however many years. So I think that goes a long ways. Obviously, that term of like reaction versus action, I guess. I think that, I mean, it's a tricky issue because it's so deeply rooted with the Catholic Church going back thousands of years. They have found out ways to get away with a lot of things, and they've spent some years doing so. Even with these newer evangelical churches, they're finding out very quickly how to cover up these sorts of instances. So I guess, I mean, a lot of it is just finding that line in between what is God's actual will and what has God actually said versus what are you twisting it to be to save yourself.
Maybe an easier, is relocation ever an option?
I personally believe that you should go to the authority. I mean, obviously there is a long history of our police system, or yeah, I guess our justice system not handling these cases properly. But I think at least putting this person through a trial or being confronted for the issues, even then it puts a little bit more out in the public, so he or she has to acknowledge what they have done, as well as there is that chance of being one of the 7 out of 1,000 convicted. And I think relocation, even if the person relocating them does not agree with their actions, it shows that you got away with it. You didn't have to atone for what you did. Even maybe you loved whatever church you were at before, this is hard for you to have to move. you were able to move away from the instance and the victim is not.
But in the course of relocation, or like in the Catholic instance that Dr. Soto brings up, like, okay, you just move into a different diocese and serve the church. I can't remember what word you used, in solitude. Yeah, like we talked about, you felt like it was God's calling for you to be able to do this for the rest of your life. Don't you just forfeit that at a certain point? Like, that's over for you.
And that also opens up the potential for new victims.
Right.
As said, I mean, I know part of the reason why I chose this topic was because I was talking to my neighbor about ship and keepers, in which the priest assaulted, it was an all-girls school, he assaulted the children. One of the sisters in the church found out, she was later killed. And they're still processing through all of that, but rather than an investigation taking place within the school, he was relocated to a different school. So I think that does show that I got away with it once, I can potentially do it again, and to whomever I choose.
Great job.
I think that the balance that maybe Mr. Moore is talking about, and I think you addressed this really well by saying people should go to the authorities, talking about Rachel and her story, at the very end, kind of the climax of when she spoke at his sentencing, not only was she very direct about his sin, but she was very direct about the gospel, and that she hoped for him, for his soul, that he would repent, and that he would believe, and that because Jesus died for her, he died for him too. But there was action to pay for what he has done, and that means a lifetime of prison, and he should never be around anybody who he could potentially abuse. So I think, looking at that, if we hold the gospel to such high regard that we can say to somebody who has sinned, I know that God's grace is big enough for you because it's big enough for me. But there is consequence. And I thought that she struck that that balance so well. And I thought that was like what you were talking about, Ashlyn. That was a huge point to people who were either unbelievers or disillusioned with church. She can say, and she struggled in the church. She says that. But I think that's a really good thing. And I think in a little like a microorganism here as well, we can say, you've sinned. There are consequences. They may involve, anything from expulsion to this, to a detention, but God's grace is big enough for you, and I know that because it's big enough for me. And I think she did a really good job with that.
I totally agree.
Anything else? Last call? All right, thank you, Delilah. All right, if you haven't